When you think of World War I, what comes to mind? Probably muddy trenches, desperate charges into no man's land, and the devastating battles that wiped out a generation. And you're not wrong. But the most shocking story of the Great War isn't just about how it was fought. It's about what happened after the fighting stopped. This is the story of how one war didn't just end, it fundamentally broke the world. It was a political earthquake that toppled ancient empires, a financial tidal wave that shifted global power overnight, and a social rupture that literally redrew the map of our planet. That armistice in 1918 wasn't really an end. It was the beginning of the political fault lines, economic realities, and cultural scars that are still shaping our world right now. So, if you want to understand the 21st century, you have to start here, with the shocking legacies of the war that was supposed to end all wars. Before 1914, huge chunks of the world were ruled by vast, centuries-old empires. These were dynasties that seemed eternal. By 1922, 4 of them were just gone. This wasn't just a political shift. It was the extinction of an entire way of running the world. First, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very power whose ultimatum to Serbia lit the war's fuse. Ruled by the ancient House of Habsburg, this sprawling empire was a patchwork of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, and more. The immense pressure of the war, combined with a surge of nationalism, caused it to shatter with breathtaking speed in 1918. From its ashes, a bunch of new, often weak and squabbling nations were born. Austria and Hungary were cut down to small, separate countries, just shadows of their former glory. New nations, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, emerged, trying to cram different ethnic groups under one flag. It was the complete meltdown of a major European power. Next, the German Empire. Forged in 1871, Germany was the continent's industrial and military heavyweight. But its defeat in 1918 led to the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the end of the monarchy itself. Germany became the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy born in the humiliation of defeat. It was stripped of all its overseas colonies in Africa and Asia, which were handed to the winners as mandates. It also lost key territory in Europe, most famously giving Alsace-Lorraine back to France. The empire was simply erased, replaced by a republic that many of its own people would never accept. Third, the Russian Empire. The war was an absolute disaster for the Romanov dynasty. Staggering military losses, food shortages, and chaos at home created the perfect storm for revolution. In 1917, the Tsar was overthrown, and before the year was out, Lenin's Bolsheviks had seized power and pulled Russia out of the war. This didn't just end an empire, it gave birth to the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. Russia lost huge areas of its western territory, leading to the independence of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a reborn Poland. The internal chaos then plunged the country into a brutal civil war that killed millions more than the Great War itself, creating an ideological superpower that would define the rest of the 20th century. And finally, the Ottoman Empire. For decades, it had been called the sick man of Europe, and the war proved to be a terminal illness. Siding with the Central Powers was a fatal mistake. Its defeat led to the empire being completely dismembered and carved up by the victorious Allies. In the Turkish heartland, a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk fought to create the modern secular Republic of Turkey. but its Arab provinces were divided between Britain and France, creating a brand new and incredibly volatile political landscape in the Middle East. The collapse of these four colossal empires in just a few short years was a geopolitical event on a scale that's hard to even imagine. It completely erased the 1914 world map and set the stage for a century of new conflicts. The fall of the Ottoman Empire left a massive power vacuum, and Britain and France were more than happy to fill it. While the war was still raging, they were already secretly planning how to carve up the region. In 1916, two diplomats, Britain's Sir Mark Sykes and France's Francois-Georges-Picot, literally drew a line in the sand on a map. This secret deal, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was a masterpiece of imperial cynicism. It designated future zones of control for Britain and France, completely ignoring the ethnic, religious, and tribal realities on the ground. France was to get what would become Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take what would become Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. All of this was done despite Britain having promised independence to Arab leaders to get them to revolt against the Ottomans in the first place. When the war ended, this secret plan became a reality, just dressed up as mandates from the new League of Nations. Britain and France were supposed to supervise these new territories until they were ready for self-rule. In reality, it was just colonialism with a new name. The borders were arbitrary and artificial. The new state of Iraq, for instance, was created by smashing together three distinct Ottoman provinces, one mostly Sunni, one Shia, and one Kurdish. It was a recipe for sectarian conflict that has haunted the country ever since. The legacy of these lines in the sand has been a century of conflict, creating states with deep internal divisions and sowing a profound sense of betrayal among Arab populations. The modern conflicts, the struggles for identity, and the very borders of the Middle East are the direct, poisonous legacy of a backroom deal struck by two European diplomats over 100 years ago. If the goal of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference was to build a lasting peace, it was one of history's most spectacular failures. The main treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, was forced on Germany and became, as one French marshal grimly predicted, an armistice for 20 years. US President Woodrow Wilson showed up with his idealistic 14 points, hoping for a peace without victory. But the European allies, especially France, which had seen its land destroyed and a generation of men slaughtered, wanted revenge. The final treaty was a messy compromise that pleased no one and deeply humiliated Germany. Its most infamous part was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war, for a nation that felt it had fought a defensive war. This was a national humiliation that created a deep, simmering resentment. Attached to that guilt were crippling financial payments, or reparations. The final bill was a staggering 132 billion gold marks, an amount Germany's shattered economy had no hope of paying. The attempt to collect these payments would lead to French and Belgian troops occupying Germany's industrial heartland and would trigger one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history, where German money became completely worthless. The treaty also carved Germany up. On top of losing its colonies, it lost 10% of its land in Europe, which held 16% of its coal and nearly half its iron production. Its military was reduced to a tiny force of 100,000 men with no air force, no tanks, and no submarines. The Treaty of Versailles didn't pacify Germany, it enraged it. It created a powerful story of victimhood and betrayal, the stab-in-back myth that extremist parties, especially Hitler's Nazis, would use to seize power. The economic pain and national shame baked into the treaty created the perfect soil for the seeds of World War II to grow. World War I was an economic disaster for Europe, but for the United States, it was an economic miracle. The war decisively shifted the world's financial center from London to New York and launched the U.S. into its role as a global superpower. When the war started in 1914, the U.S. was actually in a recession, but as a neutral country for 3 years, it became the main factory and farm for the Allies. American factories, operating safely an ocean away, churned out steel, machinery, food, and weapons for the European war machine. U.S. exports more than doubled in just a few years. This created a huge trade imbalance. While Europe was burning through its wealth, America was collecting it. Britain and France, once the world's great lenders, went deep into debt, borrowing billions from the U.S. government and American banks. By the war's end, the United States had transformed from the world's biggest debtor nation into its top creditor. This new financial power gave it massive influence over the post-war world and cemented its position as the 20th century's dominant economic force. The contrast with Europe couldn't have been sharper. The continent was broke and physically shattered. In countries like France and Belgium, the most productive industrial and farmlands had been turned into barren moonscapes. France lost about 1.4 million soldiers, a massive chunk of its young male workforce. Even the winners were near bankruptcy. Britain, once the world's biggest investor, was now one of its biggest debtors. After the war, debt payments ate up around 40% of all government spending. Inflation shot through the roof, and the British pound lost over 60% of its value. For the losers, it was even worse. The new nations carved out of Austria-Hungary were economically weak, cut off from the markets they had been a part of for centuries. But the most dramatic case was Germany. The burden of reparations, plus the loss of industrial land, led to total economic collapse. To make its payments, the government just printed more money, leading to the infamous hyperinflation of 1923. Prices spiraled out of control to a terrifying degree. A loaf of bread that cost a quarter of a mark in 1919 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. People literally used wheelbarrows full of cash to buy groceries. This crisis wiped out the savings of the middle class and created massive social instability, destroying what little faith people had in the new government. The economic wreckage of the war would haunt Europe for decades. It's pretty amazing how the echoes of this one conflict still define our world, isn't it? If you think understanding the past is the best way to make sense of the present, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. We explore the stories that shaped our world every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming up. The scale of human loss in World War I was something modern history had never seen. The war caused about 40 million casualties, with nearly 10 million soldiers killed. To put that in perspective, more soldiers died in WWI than in all the wars of the previous 100 years combined. In France, about 1 in 5 men who went to fight never came home. In Britain, nearly a third of all men between 20 and 24 in 1914 were killed. This wasn't just a number, it was a demographic black hole. An entire generation of young men was either wiped out, traumatized, or permanently disabled. This created the lost generation, survivors who were profoundly disillusioned, cynical, and haunted by the industrial slaughter they'd seen. You can feel this trauma in the bleak poetry of Wilfred Owen and in Eric Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. The war also left behind new kinds of wounds. Shell shock, which we now call PTSD, was everywhere but was completely misunderstood. And the nature of the war, with machine guns, artillery, and poison gas, created horrific injuries on a mass scale, leaving millions permanently maimed. The staggering loss of life and the psychological scars it left behind shattered the optimism of the pre-war era. The war acted like a violent catalyst for social change, flipping old traditions on their head. One of the biggest shifts was for women. With millions of men at the front, women flooded into the workforce in record numbers. They worked in munitions factories, drove buses, and took on all sorts of jobs that had been for men only. This didn't just prove they could do the work. It gave them a new sense of economic and social freedom. That momentum was a key factor in the final push for women's suffrage, with countries like Britain, Germany, and the US giving women the right to vote right after the war. The war also empowered labor movements. Governments desperate to keep the factories running had to negotiate with trade unions, giving in on things like wages and working conditions. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia also sent a wave of fear through Western governments, making them more willing to grant reforms like the 8-hour workday to avoid their own revolutions. Finally, the war sowed the seeds of anti-colonial rebellion. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean fought and died for their imperial rulers. They were told they were fighting for freedom and civilization. But when the war ended, the idea of self-determination was really only applied to Europeans. Colonial subjects were denied the very independence they had fought for. This hypocrisy fueled a new fire in nationalist and independence movements that would eventually bring the colonial empires crashing down in the decades after World War II. The sheer horror and global scale of the war forced people to think in new ways. The biggest example was the League of Nations, the first major global organization designed to maintain peace. Now, the League ultimately failed, was crippled from the start because the US refused to join, and it had no real power to enforce its decisions. But the idea itself was revolutionary. It established the principle of international cooperation that would later be reborn as the United Nations. On a more everyday level, the war gave us the modern passport. Before 1914, you could wander through most of Europe with little more than a business card. The war brought in strict border controls and passports as security measures, and they just never left. The war also slammed the accelerator on medical and technological innovation. The flood of casualties forced doctors to invent new techniques. This period saw the invention of triage to manage mass casualties, mobile X-ray units pioneered by Marie Curie, the first blood banks for transfusions, and incredible advances in plastic surgery to rebuild the horrific facial injuries common in trench warfare. Many methods developed out of sheer desperation are still used in surgery today. The war didn't just break bodies and nations. It broke the entire spirit of the 19th century. That old pre-war belief in progress, reason, and the glory of civilization seemed like a sick joke after 4 years of mechanized slaughter. This deep disillusionment gave birth to new art and literary movements that rejected everything the old world stood for. Movements like Dadaism and Surrealism sprung up in Europe, mocking logic and celebrating the absurd as the only sane response to the insanity of the war. In literature, lost generation writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald captured a mood of cynicism, aimlessness, and broken dreams. Architecture shifted to the clean, unornamented lines of modernism, a clear rejection of the stuffy, decorative styles of the old empires. This cultural shift was a direct reaction to the trauma of the war, an attempt to find a new language for a shattered world. Perhaps the most tragic legacy of all is how directly World War I led to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, as we saw, created so much bitterness in Germany that it made Hitler's rise to power possible. The economic instability of the 1920s, a direct result of war debts and reparations, paved the way for the Great Depression, which in turn fueled extremist politics all over the world. The new nations created in Eastern Europe were often unstable, full of resentful ethnic minorities and border disputes. The new country of Czechoslovakia, for example, had a large German-speaking population in a region called the Sudetenland, which became Hitler's excuse to invade in 1938 in Asia. The treaty gave German territories in China to Japan instead of returning them to China, fueling Chinese nationalism and Japanese militarism. The war that was meant to end all wars did nothing of the sort. Instead, it just created a new set of grievances, new ideologies, and new fault lines that would erupt into an even bigger global conflict just 20 years later. When the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world that soldiers had left behind in 1914 was gone for good. The war was more than a conflict. It was a fundamental reordering of the globe. It shattered 4 empires, redrew the maps of Europe and the Middle East, and created a new world order dominated by the United States. It unleashed new ideologies, accelerated massive social changes, and gave birth to technologies and institutions that are still part of our lives. The trenches were silenced a long time ago, but the echoes of that war have never really faded. You can still hear them in the political tensions of the Middle East, born from those lines drawn on a map. You can see them in the very existence of the United Nations, an idea forged in the failures of the League of Nations. You can feel them in the economic power structures that still shape our world. The Great War may be over, but its shocking legacy is the world we are all living in today.